Welcome to the Community Initiatives Program Operating Grant Stream Information Session. The purpose of this information session is to provide general information and clarity about the CIP Operating Program and explain the funding priorities for the program. First, I'd like to thank you for your interest in CIP Operating and for wanting to make a positive difference in the lives of Albertans. We hope this session will be helpful to you to learn more about the program and whether it is a good fit for your organization. Here's the agenda for the information session. I will begin by highlighting the updates that have been made in our current program guidelines. Next, I will provide an overview of the CIP operating program, and this will include taking some time to review the matching eligibility fundraising worksheet. And lastly, I will go over funding criteria and application tips. The Community Initiatives Program aims to foster healthy, vibrant communities across Alberta. It was designed to support the efforts of nonprofit organizations that contribute to their communities and to create opportunities for Albertans to engage with their communities. Within CIP, there are various programs including the operating stream and the project-based stream. As a unique stream, the CIP operating funding provides grants to support eligible nonprofit organizations in Alberta that support social issues to enhance the organization's ability to operate and deliver direct services to the vulnerable and disadvantaged in Alberta. Community grants programs, including CIP Operating, are reviewed at a minimum every 5 years to ensure that the guidelines best support the needs of Alberta's communities and align with best practices in grant administration. The CIP Operating guidelines were recently updated in 2023. CIP Operating has moved from 3 application intakes a year to 2. The new application intake deadline dates are January 30th and July 15th annually. Section 3 of the guidelines, which provides information on eligibility requirements, has been updated for clarity. Please note that organizations whose primary mission and purpose do not align clearly with the CIP operating outcomes in Section 1.2 of the guidelines, or the definition and examples of social issues provided in Section 3.1 of the guidelines, are not eligible to apply to CIP operating. Additionally, organizations whose primary mandate is sport or arts related are not eligible for funding from CIP operating, as stated in Section 3.2 of the guidelines. As described in Section 4.6 of the guidelines, priority consideration is given to organizations with an annual operating budget under $2 million. While this has stayed consistent with our previous guidelines, what has changed is that applications from organizations with operating budgets between $2 million and $3.5 million may be considered a priority if they can demonstrate the significance of CIP operating funding will have on the delivery of their programs and services. Section 1.2 of the guidelines outlines the key priority outcomes and indicators of success according to our ministry's grant accountability framework. Applications who receive CIP operating funding will be required to report on these outcomes. To start, I'd like to stress that the most important thing you can do before applying to CIP operating is to read the program guidelines to ensure your organization, community collaborative, First Nation, or Métis settlement, its primary mission and purpose, and its programs and services align well with the grant program's purpose. To be eligible to apply for a CIP operating grant, all applicants must be registered and in good standing under one of the acts listed on the slide, or be classified as a First Nation or a Métis settlement, or be a community collaborative. Please note that community collaboratives must meet additional eligibility requirements to be considered. These are outlined in Section 3.1.3 of the guidelines. Throughout this presentation, I'll be using the term organization to refer to single nonprofit organizations, community collaboratives, First Nations, and Métis settlements. All organizations must be legally registered or incorporated for a minimum of 1 full year before they are eligible to apply to CIP operating. For example, organizations that were registered in December of 2023 would first be eligible to apply to the January 30th, 2025 application intake deadline. And an organization that is registered in February of 2023 would first be eligible to apply for the July 15th, 2024 intake. In addition, your organization must have 1 full year of financial statements available to submit with its application. Some things to remember are only organizations that have active status with Alberta Corporate Registry or registered status with the Canadian Revenue Agency are eligible to apply. If you are not sure about your status, you can contact Alberta Corporate Registry or view the list of charities on the Canadian Revenue Agency's website. Organizations that have overdue or incomplete reporting related to any grant previously awarded by Arts, Culture, and Status with Women are not eligible to apply until their outstanding accounting and reporting requirements have been submitted and approved. If you are unsure if your organization has outstanding accounting, contact our office prior to submitting your application. As identified in the guidelines update slides, applications from organizations whose primary mission and purpose do not clearly align with the CIP operating outcomes or the examples of social issues are not eligible to apply. Let's look more closely at outcomes and social issues. The 10 key program outcomes and indicators of success are listed in section 1.2 of the guidelines. There are 3 outcome types: ultimate, which we hope to achieve in the long term; intermediate, which we hope to achieve in the medium term; and immediate, which we hope to achieve in the short term. This slide lists the ultimate outcomes. If your organization is approved for funding, the immediate and intermediate outcomes are the ones that you will be reporting on in your final report. We'll go through them on the next 3 slides. The intermediate outcomes are through direct programs and services and capacity building training and supports that address social issues, vulnerable, disadvantaged, and at-risk Albertans experience improvements in their quality of life. Nonprofit organizations and community collaboratives are stable and have sustained capacity to improve programs and services that address social issues. And nonprofit organizations and community collaboratives are able to strengthen the mental health, well-being, and skills of the nonprofit sector workforce, staff, and volunteers. The first 2 immediate outcomes are vulnerable, disadvantaged, and at-risk Albertans have access to programs and services that they require for their immediate needs. Nonprofit organizations and community collaboratives invest in their infrastructure capacity to maintain or enhance programs and services that address social needs. And the final 3 immediate outcomes are staff and volunteer are able to access training they need to effectively operate and govern their organization. Employment and volunteer opportunities are available in the social serving nonprofit sector, and organizations explore partnerships and collaboration with other organizations to develop integrated networks and wraparound services. For the purpose of the CIP operating grant stream, social issues is defined as conditions or societal behaviors that negatively affect people, for example, poverty and unhoused, and need to be addressed and repaired. The conditions affect large numbers of people in a damaging way, and society overall perceives that they require public attention and action. This definition can be found in section 3.1 of the guidelines. Please see other important definitions in this section, including the definitions of vulnerable, disadvantaged, and at risk, as these terms are referenced in both the grant purpose and the program outcome. For the purpose of the CIP operating grant stream, social issues include food security, shelter, poverty or homelessness, safety from violence, trauma and harm, mental health, addictions, physical or cognitive disability, isolated seniors, individuals in personal crisis, critical adult and child's programming addressing basic life skills, individuals experiencing barriers or stigma due to race, gender, sexual orientation, ethnicity, or age. If you are unsure if your organization is eligible to apply to CIP operating, please contact our office to discuss. The CIP operating grant stream is heavily oversubscribed. Usually we are only able to fund approximately 1/3 of applications submitted. Due to this, organizations addressing the social issues of food security, shelter, poverty or homelessness, and safety from violence, trauma, and harm will be given priority. You will see this point noted when you are completing your application in Gate Front Office. This doesn't necessarily mean that organizations that address other social issues will not receive funding. What it does mean is that the priority of the 3 social issues will be considered when evaluating applications. Another point, CIP Operating is primarily intended to fund the ongoing operations of small to medium nonprofit organizations with a total annual operating cost of less than $2 million. However, as mentioned previously in the guideline updates, organizations with operating budgets between $2 million and $3.5 million may be considered a priority as well. Please note that there are additional considerations detailed in sections 4.6 and 4.7 of the guidelines. We will touch on these later in the presentation. Once you have determined that your organization is eligible to apply and it is a good fit with CIP Operating's purpose and priorities, you'll be ready to begin the application process. As mentioned previously, we now have 2 application intake deadlines, which are January 30th and July 15th annually. The review and decision-making process takes approximately 6 months, so if you're applying to the January 30th intake, you should receive notification of decision in July. And if you apply to the July 15th intake, you should receive notification in January of the following year. Applicants will receive an email to notify them of the decision regarding their application. Please note that all decisions on grant applications are final and no appeals will be considered. Please be aware that costs incurred prior to the application intake deadline are not eligible to be covered by CIP operating funding. Although costs that occur after the deadline are eligible for funding, this is done at your own risk as funding is never guaranteed. Within the CIP operating maximum funding request of $75,000, there are 2 funding levels. Core funding is for administrative, operational, and program expenses needed to conduct operations and advance the organization's mission. The maximum core funding grant request is $60,000, which must be matched. I will explain eligible expenses and the uniqueness of CIP operating matching later in the session. Organizational development funding, also known as ODF, is for initiatives and activities that strengthen the organization's capacity. The maximum amount of ODF that can be requested is $15,000 and is non-matching. Please note, you cannot apply for ODF on its own. If an organization applies only for ODF, the application will be canceled. CIP Operating funds administrative and ongoing operational costs for a maximum of 2 years. Organizations may only be approved for CIP Operating once every 3 years. This ensures that different organizations can be considered for funding within a 3 to 4 year period. CIP Operating recognizes the importance of internal organizational capacity and the need for organizations to operate with core leadership and essential staff. Funding requests for executive directors, volunteer coordinators, and other positions and costs not directly attached to programs are commonly considered. This slide shows examples of eligible core expenses. These include operating and program expenses that an organization incurs on an ongoing basis, such as wages and salaries, staff and volunteer training, minor equipment purchases, rent, utilities, insurance, communication costs, travel within Alberta, office and program supplies, evaluation, data collection, auditing, and reporting. For organizations that have limited cash costs to date, CIP Operating considers whether your organization has the capacity to generate the necessary revenue to cover the requested core operating expenses in the future. We also consider your organization's experience managing and reporting on cash revenue and expenses. Your organization is expected to manage your financial resources and demonstrate steady, manageable growth. We encourage you to base your CIP operating requests on the funds you've been able to raise recently. If your application does not clearly demonstrate your organization's ability to deliver programs and services and generate cash revenue to support your request for funding, your application will be canceled. Organizational development funding, also known as ODF. Remember, applying for ODF is optional. If your organization only wants to apply for core funding, that is fine. ODF is intended to support a range of strategic, responsive, or innovative actions that strengthen the organization's skill, capacity, and ability to deliver its mission and increase its long-term stability. To be eligible for ODF, you must complete a capacity assessment tool to determine your internal strengths and weaknesses in these 4 areas. First is strategic leadership. This is the ability of board members and senior leaders to inspire, prioritize, provide direction, make decisions, and innovate to achieve the organization's mission. Second is the adaptive capacity. This is the ability of the organization to monitor, assess, and respond to internal and external change to improve the organization's performance, relevance, and impact. Third is management capacity. This is the ability of the organization to ensure the effective and efficient use of its resources. Last is operational capacity. This is the ability of the organization to develop, implement, evaluate, and improve programs and services and operating ability. The purpose of the assessment tool is to enable organizations to identify opportunities to strengthen their organization and to set priorities for the organizational development activities which you will be identifying in the grant application. We encourage you to go through this tool with your board or have each board member complete it and then submit the average scores in your application. To get the best use from the tool, I encourage you to critically reflect on and honestly score your application against the capacity indicators in the tool. Your scores on the assessment will not impact funding decisions. The capacity assessment tool is available as part of your application in front office. You can also find it in the CIP Operating website. In your application, you will enter the scores from the assessment tool for each capacity area that you are requesting funding for. You will also provide a clear plan of organizational development activities that you propose to use ODF towards to strengthen the capacity area. In your application, you are required to provide quotes or source of estimates to show how the organizational development activity costs were determined. On this slide, there are examples of eligible organizational development initiatives. These are also listed and expanded on in section 3.3.3 of the guidelines. Some examples of ODF activities are website development, creating and implementing a fund development strategy, purchasing a specialized software such as an accounting software, improving procedures to track and report on outcomes and results to funders, strategic planning, or specialized training. Please be aware that ODF cannot be used to pay existing staff to execute the initiative. ODF funding is intended to strengthen your organization's skills and capacity by helping you implement initiatives and complete activities that staff in your organization do not currently have the skills or time to do. You can use the funds to connect with experts to provide support to complete your ODF activities. As shown on this slide, there are several mandatory documents you will include with your application. You will upload them into your application in Gate Front Office. Ensure you provide the most recent full fiscal year financial statements for your organization and be sure it is signed by 2 signing authorities of the organization. If you are applying as a community collaborative, the organization applying as the fiscal agent should submit their financial statements. Bank statements and trial balances are not accepted as financial statements for CIP Operating. In addition to the mandatory documents, there are additional documents that may be required. I'd like to highlight financial statements. If your fiscal year ends more than 3 months prior to the application intake deadline date, you must also submit current interim financial statements, consisting of a statement of financial position, also known as a balance sheet, and a statement of operations, also known as an income statement or statement of revenues and expenses. The interim financial statements may be produced in-house by the treasurer or a staff member. They must be signed by 2 signing authorities of the organization. Please be aware that applications may be returned if they are incomplete. You are welcome to provide additional information that you think may be helpful and important to the review of your application. For example, you may wish to provide support letters from community partners and organizations, or testimonials from individuals or families that recognize and support the need and benefit of the programs and services your organization provides. You can upload these additional documents into the File Attachment section of your application in Gate Front Office. Next, we will discuss how to complete the matching worksheet within your application in Gate Front Office. The CIP Operating Grant has a unique matching feature that is based on community support for your organization. The amount of core funding your organization is eligible to receive is equal to the community support your organization has received to a maximum of $60,000. To complete the matching worksheet, use information from your most recent full fiscal year or interim financial period, whichever benefits your organization the most. The financial statements that you provide with your application will be used to support and verify the information in the worksheet. Matching is based on actual recent results only, not anticipated or projected revenue. Matching must be equal to or exceed your core funding grant request amount. Matching can include community support up to and including the application intake deadline. Eligible cash matching revenue includes family, private, and community foundation grants, United Way funding, bingo and casino funds, corporate donations, private donations, revenue from fundraising events or activities, facility rental revenue, and social enterprise. Please note government-based funding, including municipal, provincial, and federal funding, is not eligible to be used towards community fundraising matching. Other ineligible matching sources include anticipated or projected revenue, registration fees, program fees, membership fees, contract fees, interest, and loans. You may also use in-kind goods and services given to your organization by the community towards your match. Eligible in-kind goods and services are required in the most recent fiscal year or current financial period. The amounts are based on fair market value, and amounts over $1,000 must be explained or a support letter should be provided. Anticipated or projected goods and services, and federal, provincial, or municipal government-based services staff and space are ineligible. You may also demonstrate community support through volunteer hours. Eligible volunteer hours are all actual hours for the entire organization for the most recent fiscal year or current financial period at a flat rate of $20 per hour per volunteer. Volunteer hours including board or committee meetings, administrative event, and program-related services. And if volunteers are not formally recorded, you may estimate the total volunteer hours. Please keep your calculations in case you require clarification or if your file is selected for audit. Ineligible volunteer hours include hours valued at more than $20 per hour, hours that are worked for another organization's benefit, or hours that were worked by staff who were paid for working them by another entity. If you have questions about your organization's matching eligibility, please contact us for clarification. When you call, please have your recent financial statements available so that we can help guide you. As stated in Section 4.4 of the guidelines, an important criteria used to evaluate and determine possible core funding is your organization's capacity and financial stability. When demonstrating community-based fundraising matching, your organization's cash revenue generation capacity is an important consideration. While in-kind goods and services and volunteer hours are important community support for your organization and are eligible matching sources, it is important for you to know that your organization is expected to have the ability to raise cash to ensure it can sustain operating costs beyond CIP operating funding if received. Please note that funding is not guaranteed. If your match is met mainly or entirely through in-kind goods and services and volunteer hours, this will influence the evaluation of your application. For those that have applied to CIP Operating before, you will note that we no longer have a separate budget document for you to complete. Instead, in your Gate Front Office application, you will choose the expenses that you want CIP operating funds to cover as shown on the slide. The list of expenses comes right after the matching worksheet in your Gate Front Office application. Now let's get into funding criteria and application tips. Please be aware that on our website there are links to sample applications, one for single nonprofit organizations and one for community collaboratives. These are available to help support you when submitting your application. Sometimes it is helpful to write responses to the application questions before you begin working in Gate Front Office to give you some time to think about them. The sample application have all the questions to answer and tell you what other documents you will need to attach in your application in Gate Front Office. CIP operating applications are evaluated based on how well they meet and align with the criteria listed in Section 4 of the guidelines. Listed on the slide is the program criteria. Each criteria contains several factors. Organizations must provide evidence or demonstrate how they meet the factors. It is crucial that you familiarize yourself with the criteria so that you can show how you meet them in your application. We will go more into depth on each criteria in the following slides. These slides are intended to get you thinking about your organization and its programs and services in relation to the purpose of the CIP Operating Grant. They should help you put the criteria into context that will help you determine if the criteria is reflected in your organization and its programs and services. First, we will talk about program outcomes. As you will recall from earlier in the presentation, we went through the key program outcomes and indicators of success, those ultimate, intermediate, and immediate outcomes. Focusing on the intermediate and immediate outcomes, try turning each one into a question. If you can answer the question thoroughly, this shows that your organization and its programs align with the outcomes. Then you can use your responses in the application as appropriate. For example, how do my organization's programs and services support vulnerable, disadvantaged, and at-risk Albertans to experience improvements in their quality of life? Is my organization stable? And does it have the capacity to improve its programs and services? The next criteria is organization capacity and community impact. Some questions to consider are, what is a social issue and need or gap that the organization is addressing? Do you serve vulnerable, disadvantaged, and at-risk Albertans on a daily or regular basis? Does your organization tell a clear story of its work, the focus of its programming, and the demographics it serves? How broad is its impact in the community? The next criteria is connecting and engaging with community. Some questions to consider are there other organizations already providing similar programs and services? How can you avoid duplication? How do you connect and engage with these organizations? Have you provided support letters? Regarding organization capacity, an organization is considered a lower risk if it has comprehensive oversight by and broad representation on its board of directors. It is also considered lower risk if it has an extended history of delivering programs and services. Some questions to consider: is your board made up of at least 5 members from within Alberta? Is there any perceived conflict of interest related to volunteer, staff, or contract positions taken on by the organization? Does your organization's background history, its mission and purpose, organization size and representation, and length of time in operation demonstrate its ability to deliver programs and services? When considering financial stability, organizations are considered lower risk if they have no significant debts or loans that have not been addressed. Some questions to consider are, does your organization demonstrate the ability to raise funds to sustain its operating costs? Does it have diverse funding sources? Has your organization been operating within the limits of its available financial resources and within reasonable net profit or loss? Does your organization have debts, loans, or significant liabilities? Do you have sufficient experience in managing cash revenues equal to or exceeding the grant funding amount requested? Based on your recent operations, is the amount requested reasonable? If you are requesting funds for staff wages and salaries, are they for current positions? If you are intending to add staff, will you be able to sustain that position? The next criteria is economic impact. Some points to consider are, does your organization support the health and well-being of Albertans who are disproportionately impacted by barriers and stigma? Does it deliver innovative, strong, and sustainable programs and services that support Alberta's social and economic success? Does it generate direct and indirect economic activity by creating income-earning opportunities and securing additional investments? And does it provide employment and volunteer opportunities? As mentioned earlier in the presentation, CIP Operating has priority considerations as part of its application evaluation. Additional priority considerations are: does your region have high needs? Is your organization located in a remote, rural part of Alberta with limited services and limited opportunities to generate revenue? Do you serve multiple communities of need? Has your ability to generate revenue been significantly reduced because of wildfire, flood, or another catastrophic event? Was your organization providing critical services during this disaster? Would your programs and services be considered best practice or an innovative model, and in what way? Does your organization receive regular funding from the Alberta government? Please note that if your organization does receive regular Government of Alberta funding, it will be considered a lower priority. However, if you can identify and explain the need for CIP operating funding, your organization may still be considered a priority. I will explain this further on the next slide. The final criteria for core funding is other considerations. Does your organization demonstrate a need for funding? For example, does it have less than 2 years of annual operating reserves? Has your organization already received significant funding from community grants? If it has received a lot of funding in recent years, your application may be considered a lower priority. If your organization receives regular funding from other Alberta government ministries, can you make a compelling argument for your need for CIP operating funds? For example, CIP operating dollars would be used to cover operating costs of a program or service that fills a community need but does not receive any of your current provincial government funding dollars. Or you want to use CIP operating funds to create a new or innovative program or collaboration. Or current provincial funding doesn't fully cover your current program costs. Or your total administration and overhead costs are more than what is covered by your provincial government funding. Or your provincial government funding has been reduced or eliminated, so CIP operating funding is needed to address this funding shortfall. The last consideration is the amount of CIP operating grant funding that is available. As mentioned previously, the CIP operating grant stream is highly oversubscribed. This is where the priority social issues of food security, shelter, and immediate safety come into consideration. Here are a few organizational development funding tips and questions to consider. Firstly, have you completed the capacity assessment tool? Will the proposed activity improve a capacity area that you have identified in the capacity assessment tool? Did you provide quotes or document your estimate sources? Proposed organizational development activities will be assessed based on the suitability of the organizational development activity for the organization's needs, the impact of the organizational development activity that will have on your organization, the likelihood of organizational improvement. Organizational development funding will also be assessed on ongoing benefits of the organization and community, opportunities for the organization to share the knowledge and skills gained, retained learning within the organization, and involvement of board, staff, and volunteers. This concludes the CIP operating information session. If you have any questions, please contact Community Grants at 1-800-642-3855 or through email at communitygrants@gov.ab.ca.